So in this video, we're going to cover a workflow strategy for coding with Python in Codespaces that I like to call the tinker, copy, run, repeat method. It's very simple, and it is one that allows you to work really incrementally so that you don't end up writing big long stretches of code and then try running it and get all sorts of bugs and get confused. That can happen when you write too many lines of code at once before testing that everything's working. So step one is obviously opening up Codespaces, which you can see I've done here. The other thing you're going to make sure you want to do is up in the upper right corner, there's a little button called Toggle Panel, and this is a way to turn various panels on and off in Codespaces. I'm going to click this, and this is actually going to open the bash shell. You can see that it's the bash shell by this button right here. If you're not on this terminal tab, make sure you click into it. And this is, again, a text-based interface into this little virtual machine running on the cloud. And you can see I have some files over here in my file explorer. So if I was to use a basic shell command called ls, that'll list the contents. And I can see, oh, okay, well, I'm currently in the folder where those files exist. And that's exactly where I want to be. So for this example, I'm just going to create a new file. Let's just do a simple numbers example. So I'll call it numbers.py. And let's create a few numbers here. 1, 2, 3, 4. That should get us started. So I know this doesn't seem like a lot of code, but this is what I mean when I say work incrementally. You don't want to write too much code before you get try to test things to make sure they're working. So one way to do this, you see that I kind of cheated here on the method that I wanted to show you, but you could go to your command line and then just run this to see if it works. And it does. I mean, it didn't really do anything, but at least it didn't give us any errors. But the copy portion of this really requires you to open yet another terminal so you can add another bash shell. And you can see now over in this right panel, I have two bash shells. Now one of them I'm going to use to start a Python interactive interpreter. So I'm just going to type the word Python. And remember, when you type Python without the name of a Python script, it'll just drop you into this interactive environment. And you know that you're there because you'll see this little message. But even if that message goes away after you write some code, these three greater than symbols, they're known as a chevron. Those are your indicator. It's a prompt telling you, okay, you are now in an interactive Python environment. So the way I'd like you to work is, let's say that you had started here and you created a little numbers. Just got to get rid of some of these pop-ups. Let's start this way. All right, so now I can test, okay, I have a list containing 4 numbers. So you could actually take this and let's pretend we hadn't put this code there to begin with and just copy and paste it. Literally just one line of code. Now, before you go writing any more code in your shell, your Python shell, hop back to bash by clicking the tab. Now run numbers again just to make sure everything is good, and it looks like we're good, no errors. Let's say that we wanted to do something to these numbers. So I'm going to hop back to Python. I click this other tab, and I see that I have my chevrons. So I'm going to do, I don't know, let's do some multiplication. For number in numbers. And you can see, by the way, that Python has auto-magically indented the code for us. But I'm going to go one more just to be safe. And do, I don't know, let's see, print number times 2. Okay? And you're going to have to hit return twice just to let the interpreter know that you're done coding. And it gives me my expected result. So if I know that that code is working as I expect, now I'm ready to copy it back over. And here's where you're going to want to be really careful. You don't want to accidentally copy the chevrons or these little dots. Those are just visual cues from the interpreter, but they will cause your code to break. And let me show you what I mean by that. So let's say you did this. You copied this code the way that I did, and you hopped over to your text editor and you pasted that in. And actually, I know that Python should only be 4 spaces. So let's say that's what we did. You can see actually this is highlighted in red, and the code editor is smart enough to tell me that already there's an error. But let's say I didn't notice that. I'm going to go back to my bash shell. I'm going to run the code and see what happens. Oh, okay. So I'm getting an indentation error, which is actually what I would expect. It's a little bit funkier than that because these 3 dots may not be obvious, but you really got to make sure you get rid of those. I like to just bring when we're dealing with a loop or a block, bring the code all the way to the left and then just hit the tab, or you can hit 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. Okay, so now before you do anything else, let's go ahead and test again. And on your when you hop back into bash, you can actually just hit the up arrow and move back in your history of commands, and it'll give you the command so you don't have to type it all over again. So I'm going to hit enter, and we got what we expected. So that's good. So the point here is that hopefully you can see I'm very incrementally writing a little snippet of code over in the Python interpreter. Once I'm confident that it works the way I expect it to, I'm copying it back over into the shell. That's the copy step. Then I'm going to run it in the bash terminal. That's the run step. And then once I have confidence that everything works as expected, I just repeat that process, line after line after line. Now, a couple things that are worth mentioning. First, this workflow in the interactive shell can get a little tedious after you've written quite a few lines of code. Let's say instead of just 4 lines, you had 40 lines. That's the point where you might want to maybe abandon this approach and just stick to writing code incrementally in your text editor and then running it on the command line, and just rinsing and repeating that process. You're still working incrementally, but sometimes when you start developing a lot of code over here in the Python interpreter, it can get a little cumbersome, especially if you accidentally close this Python interpreter. And we should talk about that because that's a bit of a gotcha and it can be confusing. So let's say that I close this. Now I'm going to open it again. And let's see, is numbers in there? Nope. So Python, the interactive interpreter, really has no memory of what you did the last time you were in the interpreter. So that's an important thing to remember. And this can be problematic, like if you had written a bunch of code and then shut down your code space, including the Python shell, and then came back and started trying to use the shell again, you would need to copy and paste all of the stuff here in numbers.py back into the shell. And again, if you have lots and lots of lines of code, that's the point where this type of workflow might get a little tedious. But there's nothing stopping you from, again, focusing primarily on your script where you're writing code and then just running it on the command line as you add little bits of code incrementally. So that's the overall workflow. One last gotcha that's worth mentioning that I've seen trip up some students in the past is the Python shell has no understanding of what you're doing in this script. Just because you wrote this script and then perhaps ran it over here on the bash shell, that has no bearing, again, on what this interactive shell has access to. In other words, if you were to run your script over here in the bash shell and hop back to Python, Python has, it's not like you've magically initialized all of this code in your shell. You see that I'm still getting errors. So again, the shell for Python and the shell for like the standard bash terminal are 2 totally separate environments. They don't typically interoperate with each other. And so you just got to keep that in mind. They're 2 distinct, separate environments. But again, this way of working incrementally, especially when you're starting out, can really be helpful with Python code and actually lots of other types of code. It's just an interesting way to work. Last thing worth mentioning is you don't have to use the Python shell on the command line. Recall we have Jupyter Lite, which is also an option, or just a Jupyter notebook in general. the one we created for class is always an option. And this really is basically the Python shell, but with a nice graphical interface slapped on top of it. Some people prefer this. I personally prefer to stay in one tab in my browser, and so I don't have to do context switching. But if you find that you're uncomfortable on the command line Python interactive interpreter, you can always type your code in a Jupyter-Lite notebook, and once you have it working, oh, that looks good, copy and paste from there instead, back over into Codespaces. And the one benefit of that approach actually is you kind of avoid some of those little snags with accidentally copying over the dots, that kind of thing. So it's kind of pick your own poison, but both of those approaches work nicely for working very incrementally, making sure your code works, and then transferring it to your final script. So that's the overall workflow.